Hey, this is Pastor Tom with North Glencoe Baptist Church, and you're watching Not Another Church Podcast. This is a weekly podcast featuring church staff and your host, Pastor Tom. So thanks for tuning in. All right, so welcome to another episode of Not Another Church Podcast. I want to today take some time and go through and kind of review the sermon. Obviously, that's a heady topic. As I kind of opened up the sermon and said, no preacher ever has said, hey, you know what I really want to cover this weekend? I want to really hit politics. Because people have a tendency to be really passionate about their beliefs politically. And so I guess pastoral suicide comes to mind.
You got to imagine a lot of guys who got brave and said that statement didn't survive the weekend.
Yes. Well, one of the truths that I was taught at seminary is you're always one sermon away from getting fired.
Yeah.
It only takes one time for you to really hose it up, and then the other 51 sermons that year, nobody's going to go, yeah, but he did preach on Jesus and the little children that time.
What have you done for me lately?
Yep.
Well, I guess, we've said we fear the open mic, and so preachers should fear the open mic, even if they're behind it.
It's very good when we remind you of that.
Yes. Well, I thankfully have Ann sitting on the front row that gives me these worried looks, or there have literally been times when she bows her head and starts praying. And I'm like, okay, I must be in some kind of territory.
You had a few moments today where I was like, oh, Ann's going to get it for that one. Castration was one of them. And old Biddy was the other one.
I'm not going to lie, I chuckled with old Biddy.
When you said
she's a drunk hag, I thought he did not just say that.
When he tried to kill his mom, and apparently his mom was a tough old Biddy. And I was like, oh my gosh. Emily looked back at me and she goes, oof, that was close.
Wow, yeah, that.
We could always record you and just rebroadcast you on the big screen and edit what we don't like.
Yeah, well, that's
works for some
probably not
preachers.
a bad idea to say, okay, this sermon is brought to you with a 5-second delay.
Yeah.
And we'll let Ann monitor the sneeze button. Oh, no.
Nope, nobody needs to hear
Or we
that.
could put, the little thing where it says, please stand by, whatever.
The
Little
technical
Indian,
problem.
Yeah, the technical problem.
If you could throw
Play
in
elevator
those
music. Yeah.
color bands with the
Yeah,
lights,
yeah.
throw that up and go technically.
Please stand by.
We are experiencing some technical difficulties.
Somebody go turn the antenna.
We need a big drapery that falls from the ceiling that does that.
Like the Muppets.
Yeah.
Like this is the same Muppet show.
Just falls, and it sees us.
Just knocks him out.
The big hook that just comes and pulls him back.
Is that like the golden buzzer as the staff? Do we get to sit at the table and give him the golden buzzer?
Oh, that's right. Just have some X's lined up in the back.
Yeah.
That would be awesome. We had the voice, had the chairs that spin around.
could hang it back
now I'm
there.
getting a little crazy. But
Put it back here over the sound booth, and one of us just hit X. That's my
that's
first
it.
I'm
X.
sorry, Pastor Tom. That sermon has been
like
X'd out.
baseball games where they hold the
Cancel
X
culture.
up when there's a strikeout, like.
And 3 strikes, the curtain drops.
All right.
Okay, so we started out, and the whole principle that the sermon derived from was that Jesus says, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, render unto God the things that are God. And I think most people get that clearly Jesus is saying there's a difference between this world that we live in and the fact that the kingdom is come and is coming in each of our hearts and in lives. And we as believers have got to constantly remind ourselves that this world is not our home. So if we're spending all of our time, all of our energy, all of our efforts to build God's kingdom through politics, which is, it's really, if you really want to get into the root of where Christian involvement the way it is in politics, it comes from, and this I hate to use big words, but it's an amillennial eschatology. And that means that people believe that the millennium is something that's coming naturally through our work. We make this world so awesome that Jesus comes back and goes, yeah, that's I'm going to start ruling there. And so the problem with that is that when amillennialism kind of died in the trenches of World War I, when people saw how bad the world could be, that some of the undergirdings politically that had been established lived on. And so we're kind of left with that, with what in the 80s was the fundamentalist resurgence and the political movements of what is now called the conservative right. And we have to be careful that we don't let that rule us. C.S. Lewis in the 50s talking about why Christians shouldn't preach against communism. And he was talking about the preachers of the day getting in the pulpit talking about the communist threat. He said, effectively, the only thing that a person does by preaching against communism, because everybody in their audience already agrees with him, that what you've done is you've made it impossible to take the world to communist. Take the gospel to communist. And so one of the things that we've done is by mixing politics and Christianity, is made it really difficult for the world to separate our politics from our Christianity.
Okay, question. So as you're talking about this and you're saying that we're not going to discuss it because, it'll make it impossible for us to carry the gospel to communism, here's my other question. You're sitting with a flock of people who are learning, who may not know what we mean when we say communism or have vague ideas of it. I'm just kind of trying to play the devil's advocate here, which is bad on a church podcast, I know. But the question then...
So Donna's the one who's pro-communist, right?
Yeah. Yeah. No. But what you get the idea there that at some point, how are they informed? Do we not need to inform them from a Christian worldview what we see it as?
Well, I think that comes back to the whole idea of balance. So if every sermon that I preach is America first and go USA, then where exactly is the gospel in that?
Right.
But the flip side of that is if you're so afraid of the touching the subject, or you don't touch the subject, nature abhors a vacuum. Somebody's going to inform people's thoughts in it. And so I think that in all things, pastoral or as we build disciples, you have to balance that out.
So where in the church do we balance that out? What is the balance of it? Is there a place where we're going to discuss it? Are we always going to neglect discussing it because we don't want to jeopardize our ability to reach out to others? How do we balance that?
Well, first of all, expository preaching to me is the answer to the question. I never would have started on a Monday morning preparing for a Sunday sermon and said, I'm going to cover politics this time. And so as you go through the Bible and verse by verse, you're going to hit subjects that you don't really want to talk about. But you have to, because everybody's going to notice, well, hey, we stopped at verse 14 last week and now we're 19. So what's there in the middle? And so that kind of forces you into discussions that you probably wouldn't choose to do otherwise. Hence, today, the title of the sermon was Politics. And so as we go through, as we were going through the book of Philippians, it brought up subjects that were very appropriate for what's going on, and it allowed us to color our worldview, but drawing from the Bible rather than us taking our preconceived ideas to the Bible. It allowed us to do, again, I hate to use fancy terms, but exegesis as opposed to eisegesis. And so taking from God's word in exegesis as opposed to taking to God's word with eisegesis. So there's this balance there. So the subjects are going to naturally flow from God's word. My hope is that which is why I shared on my Facebook post without comment, without commentary, I just shared what the platforms for both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party were on purpose, so that people, if they know God's word, can then sit down with those and say, which one of these line up with what I know of how God has called me to be. All right, with that, we end today's podcast. Thanks for watching Not Another Church Podcast with your host, Pastor Tom. We want to invite you to join us Sundays for small group at 9 a.m., worship services starting at 10 a.m., and you can find North Glencoe Baptist Church live each week on Facebook and our northglencoe.org website. If you missed church, no worries. Our past services are easily accessible. They're archived on YouTube, Vimeo, Facebook. Make sure to stay up to date by following northglencoe.org. Go serve your King.